Fantasy Baseball Cafe podcast. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, also known as @bchad50 on Twitter, and I'm joined by colleague and CBSSports.com's RJ White as the co-host of today's podcast, and hopefully many podcasts going forward. How's it going, RJ?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. Glad that it's Friday. It's been nice getting some content up on the Fantasy Baseball Cafe's website. A lot of good stuff up there right now. We got the Fantasy Team Preview Power Rankings by Brad Johnson. We've also got your rankings and my rankings as well on there for season-long ball, broken down by the top 250 as well as the positional rankings. So if you're prepping for drafts still or trying to figure out who might be available on the waiver wire that's a little bit more valuable than what you drafted, definitely get on there. Check that out. We've also got the forums, which are kicking alive and well, getting more active by the day as opening day approaches. I'd highly suggest getting on there, getting the Draft Trade Keeper thread forum, also hopping on and checking out maybe the Analyze Rate My Team if you got some questions. But a lot of good stuff up there, and not to mention the podcasts. As you're listening to one now, got some video podcasts up there. Just a lot of great content going up right now, and we're really getting ramped up and excited for fantasy baseball. But speaking of content on there, you got a piece called Riding the Wave, and you look at some speed options for people. Do you want to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, well, when you're going through a draft, you tend to look for 5-tool players as much as you can, but once you get toward the end, it gets kind of hard to find somebody that's going to help you across all of your categories that you need. And it's, as it turns out, as most people know that have gone through drafts, power tends to shrink up pretty quickly. And but you can usually find a lot of speed options toward the end of the draft, and even in free agency, depending on the size of your league going throughout the season. So when I was looking at potential waiver wire pickups, I wanted to highlight some guys that could help give a boost of speed. It turned out in a lot of my leagues I was lacking in a lot of speed after I got through with my draft. So these are guys that I've had my eye on. A few of them I've picked up. If they start to struggle, I might flip one out here and put one in. They include guys like Jared Dyson, who's a part-time player but like always steals when he's in the lineup. Eric Young, who's going to play a lot at the beginning of the season while Melvin Upton recovers, and just a few other probably 8 to 10 speed options on that article.
And they're good options, and they're widely available, as you said. I find myself in the same boat. I don't know if it's a speed bias that I have or the fact that I think that I'm getting well-rounded players and end up feeling just lacking a little bit in the speed department towards the end of drafts. Just had an auction a couple days ago. Was kind of in that boat. Definitely would suggest reading that article if you're looking for speed, or even if you're not looking for speed, just to kind of know what's out there. Maybe somebody that you can upgrade one of your players on your roster for with one of RJ's suggestions. But on that note, let's talk about some content that I posted as well. We've got some American League and National League sleepers and breakouts posted. I broke it down into two leagues. I've got an option from every single team in Major League Baseball. Obviously, we're talking about varying talent levels. We're talking about varying draft points as well, but I would suggest getting on there, checking those out. You might see some surprising names. And speaking of sleepers and breakouts and busts, that is the topic of today's podcast. And because I've always been somebody who's thought that it's best to get the bad news first and then move on to the higher note, we're going to open up with busts. I'm going to open up with one of my two busts that I uncovered, I guess you could say. One of the first is Ryan Braun. I'm seeing him drafted too rich for my blood. I understand the appeal. I'm not one of those people that looks at him and thinks, oh, geez, his power is just disintegrated because he's no longer using pads. I don't think that's the issue at all. I don't like the fact that he's been playing through a thumb injury. He says that the thumb injury is 100% at this point. That remains to be seen. I just don't think that the upside. I think that the downside. Warrants a little bit more caution than drafters are willing to throw out there right now. The upside's obviously enormous, but we're talking about a player that's on the wrong side of 30. I think that I would rather have some other options drafted around him. Just a little bit too much risk for my liking. What do you think, RJ?
I'm actually fine drafting Braun where he's ranked currently. I haven't got him in any leagues just because I might be a little bit more pessimistic than my feelings toward him indicate. But he was obviously bad last year. I actually chalk almost all of his struggles up to that chronic thumb issue. And he had that corrective surgery after the season, that I think is going to really help. It's something that obviously he hasn't gone and done before because his problems have persisted. He's looked good this spring. He hasn't had trouble with the thumb. He says it's 100%. Obviously, we don't know if it's going to hold up through a full season, but in certain circumstances, there are a lot of players that are injury risks. He has that. If he didn't have such a high ceiling, maybe I would back off. But I'm willing to take a little bit of risk that the thumb is going to crop up again because I don't think it is. But in case it does, I'm willing to take that little bit of risk to try to get that first round value. He's being drafted in the mid to late third round, just a few spots higher than the guy that I have as my bust outfielder. And I'd much rather have him over the guy that we're about to talk about in that case. So.
Well, I like how you led that off. Why don't you go ahead and tell me who your bust outfielder is, RJ?
Yeah, a guy I'm completely avoiding is George Springer. He's being drafted as a late third, maybe early fourth round pick in 12-team leagues, which to me is just insane. I mean, he was a pretty well-regarded prospect coming into 2014. He hit 303 with 37 home runs and 43 stolen bases in the minors the previous year. He did not do that in the majors last year. He hit just 231 with 20 homers and 5 stolen bases and 295 at-bats. His minor league track record makes him seem like an interesting sleeper in the middle rounds, maybe a potential breakout in the middle rounds, but he hasn't earned that third to fourth round grade yet to me. It feels like it's Bryce Harper all over again, where fantasy owners are just falling all over each other to draft upside, and they might get stuck with good but not great numbers as they wait for that breakout.
And the thing with Springer is, as well regarded as he is, at least with Bryce Harper, you kind of understood it more. Not to take anything away from Springer, but we're talking about a guy that was a Toolsy college draft pick that performed at the minor league level. We're not talking about a guy who was considered by some prospect evaluators to be like a generational talent in Bryce Harper. So I agree that George Springer is being overdrafted. Does he have the upside to be a first-round pick in 2016? Absolutely. But I think that strikeout rate, he doesn't have the health risk that we're talking about with Ryan Braun, but he does have the performance risk, which to me is even scarier with that high strikeout rate. I think you could very easily get saddled with a poor average, a few more fly balls staying in the yard, and all of a sudden that bad average isn't getting propped up by big power. I do think he's going to steal some more bases this year. I understand the upside appeal, but I think there are more rock-solid options that you can take around Springer's selection. My next bust is a guy that you and I actually agree on, judging by our email exchange earlier. Adam Wainwright, I love him. Don't get me wrong. He's a very good starting pitcher, but there's a lot of very good starting pitchers, and Adam Wainwright is not an ace anymore. His strikeout rate dropped last year. His ground ball rate dropped. Still pounding the strike zone. Gotta love the great walk rate, but we're talking more like a low to mid threes ERA starter than a sub 3 ERA starter, in my opinion. And unless he recaptures some of those strikeouts, which his swinging strike rate doesn't bode well for, then I think he's being overdrafted where he's being selected now, and I'd rather have some of the arms that are being drafted with similar potential behind him.
Yeah, his velocity was down on his fastball too. He should expect to see some negative BABIP progression. He posted a 267 mark last year that was out of line with his previous marks. He got a late start on the spring due to an abdominal issue. Wouldn't be surprising to see him struggle early in the year, even without having those other indicators, just because he's a little bit behind going in camp. I would actually bet he has a better chance of finishing with an ERA over 4 than under 3, because it just doesn't seem to me like he's ace material anymore, and we're just drafting him as with that being a given, like we've always done. So if he does pay off and is worth that value again, that's fine. But I think it's better to get out on his stock 1 year early than 1 year late, and then you have an ace on your team that's performing more like a number 3 pitcher.
Absolutely, and I agree with that assessment. I don't necessarily think he will post an ERA over 4, but I would be less shocked by that than I would be by seeing him post another sub 3 ERA. I'm in complete agreement there. Now, flipping things to the positive side of the ledger, who is your sleeper, RJ?
Well, my key hitting sleeper is Chris Davis. He burst on the scene with a 949 OPS in 153 plate appearances in 2013, but he didn't really live up to that level of play last season. He hit just 244. He posted a 299 on-base percentage, managed only 22 home runs, and that was all in 501 at-bats. His biggest issue that year was not showing any plate patience. And despite posting walk rates that were usually in the 10 to 14% range in the minors, he walked just 5.8% of the time in his plate appearances in the majors last year. The good news is he's identified that issue. He's working to be more patient. You can't trust spring numbers in many cases, but he has hit 389 and drawn 4 walks in 40 plate appearances this spring. So it's possible he's back on track and we can see a breakout performance this year.
I love the power. My biggest concern with Chris Davis is the presence of Gerardo Parra, who is a superior defender, and the fact that Davis mashes left-handed pitching and is not quite as good against right-handed pitching or hasn't been in his big league career would worry me a little bit about maybe some defensive replacement substitutions late for him, maybe the occasional day off against right-handed pitching. But if you're looking for cheap power, I definitely agree with your assessment that the improved patience will help him maybe look for a better pitch to drive. Plays in the right ballpark for power, so I see your side of the argument. I'm still a little bit skeptical of Davis, but I definitely understand where you're coming from.
But if you take into account that Ryan Braun is an injury risk with his thumb, you might put Parra in right field once Braun gets hurt, and then Davis is playing every day anyway. So if Braun turns out to actually be a bust potential, that might help Davis out. If that comes to pass.
Absolutely, and that's definitely a point worth mentioning. I agree with that completely. My sleeper, which I'm not sure if I want to identify him as a sleeper or a breakout candidate, but Travis Snyder, I'm completely enamored with him. I feel like everybody that's been around fantasy baseball for a while has probably been burned by him or known the owner that's been burned by Snyder. He was a well-regarded prospect as a former first-round pick. He had tantalizing power as a prospect. There were some concerns about his strikeout rate hurting him, his batting average in the long run, but he didn't even hit for power for the most part in his early years in the big leagues. He did tease about 5 years ago, I believe it was 2010, he teased with the power with the Blue Jays, but just hasn't done squat since until last year. And then he was a part-time player for the Pirates, had a big second half. A couple things that I'm really encouraged by in Travis Snyder's profile. He ranked ninth according to baseball heat maps in fly ball and home run average distance, which is a better indicator of power than just looking at average home run distance, because basically you're lopping off all of those warning track fly balls, and you're only taking into account the big flies, and that can be a little bit misleading. I also, more importantly, really like the cut back on strikeouts. He struck out in less than 20% of his plate appearances last year. So if you're a power hitter and you're making more contact, that's obviously a recipe for success. He was even better than that in the second half of last year. It looked like the light really went on. And finally, what I really like with Snyder as well, beyond the really late draft position, it's the fact that he's moving from pitcher-friendly PNC Park to home run-friendly Orioles Park at Camden Yards, where left-handed batters do get a boost to home run hitting. So I actually think that Travis Snyder's capable of hitting 30 home runs this year. Maybe I should stop sipping on the Kool-Aid, but at his cost, which is a very late pick, I have no problem rolling the dice on Travis Snyder. What do you think?
Yeah, I think he's a nice upside pick in Baltimore. I really like that move to bring him there and give him a regular job in right field. I would call him a sleeper more than a breakout, because in the mocks I've done and in the drafts I've done, he tends not to get picked. So I think that's basically the definition of a sleeper, is if in a standard league nobody's really paying attention to the guy, then you might have a sleeper on your hands. Whereas a breakout might be a mid-round guy that could elevate to the top of his to the top few rounds the next year. But yeah, he put together a great second half. He's in a good home park for left-handed power hitters. I like that he has that regular role, so he'll get a chance to sink or swim. So it's definitely a pick that could pay off, especially in 5 outfield leagues. People that play in 12 or 14 teams with 5 outfields might want to stick him in as their 5th outfielder, because he has that massive upside.
Absolutely. Tell me another sleeper or breakout candidate that you've got on your radar, RJ.
Yeah, well, there's one breakout candidate, a mid-round pitcher that I like, called Alex Wood. He went from swingman to potential ace with the Braves last season, posted a 2.78 ERA, and striked out nearly a batter an inning in 171 and 2/3 innings. He doesn't have any troublesome righty-lefty splits, performs just as well against either type of hitter. He made 24 starts and 11 relief appearances, was actually much better in the starts, posted a 2.59 ERA and 109 whip, while racking up 151 strikeouts and 156 and 1/3 innings in his starts. He turned things up in the second half, posted a 2.20 ERA and 108 whip while striking out 88 batters in 86 innings. I think he should be a top 20 starter, even if he just equals his overall performance last year. But if that second half is real, he could jump up into the SP1 mix. We could be talking about him as a top 10 guy next year.
I really like Alex Wood a great deal as well. When I was writing the team preview for the Daily Fantasy Cafe for the Braves, I actually suggested that I think Wood might outperform Julio Teheran, who I also like quite a bit. I know the ERA estimators aren't as big on Julio Teheran, but looking at the component stats, I do think Teheran's better than the estimators give him credit for. But having said that, I really like Wood a lot as well. I like that you pointed out the hitter splits. That was one of the first things I noted. He's equal. He's very good against both lefties and right-handed batters. I think I think Wood might be flying slightly below the radar based on the fact that he doesn't have that great prospect pedigree. And there were questions whether his delivery would lend itself to starting, but I mean, you look at the numbers, and the numbers support that there's no question whether he is a starter. The only question now is he an SP1 or is he just a really good SP2? So I'm right on board with you with Alex Wood as a breakout candidate this year, and he's a guy that if I can draft as my SP2 or better yet as my SP3 with that possible SP1 upside, hell, I'll jump all over that.
And he's a guy that I actually haven't been getting in leagues because I tend to end up getting an ace probably about the third round, and then I tend to see pretty good value in the fourth or fifth round on a guy like Hamels or somebody like that who ends up being my second starter. And then once I have that, I just ignore starting for so many rounds that I never get Alex Wood on my team. So I think I might have to switch up my strategy in one of these drafts and refuse to take a Hamels or one of those 10 to 12 guys at that level so I can get Wood in a few rounds later.
I have to wish you luck if you're going to do that. I just imagine doing that myself and then getting sniped by like a pick on that sleeper breakout candidate. And so if you do go that route, I hope you end up getting Alex Wood as your SP2 at the round that you're hoping for, because there's nothing worse. And it's funny, I laugh because I can think of some drafts and the same thing happening to me. It's like I like a lot of cheaper pitchers, but sometimes it's like the industry is gone, the fantasy baseball industry, and the experts just are talking about, wait on pitching, waiting pitching, and it's understandable because there's a lot of talent and there's a lot of ways to win with pitching, whether that's especially in deeper leagues where you can use some of these ratio boosting relievers. That I think you're starting to see some value, and it becomes hard to pass up a guy like Cole Hamels. So I understand the swerve, but if you do end up passing on Cole Hamels or one of these other value picks in your upcoming drafts, best of luck getting Alex Wood.
Thank you.
Moving on to my favorite portion of the podcast, we're going to wrap this up with some forum questions. We're going to treat it like baseball. 3 strikes and we're out. So we got 3 forum questions. The first is submitted by user Urbanator Nation. Their question is, should they trade Clayton Kershaw in a 12-team head-to-head keeper league? There's no restrictions on length of keeping and no draft penalty with the standard 5 offensive categories and quality starts, saves plus holds, ERA, and WHIP for pitchers. The offers are Josh Donaldson and John Lester for Kershaw, or Kyle Seager, Jason Hayward, and Cole Hamels. His keeper hitters are Miguel Cabrera, Anthony Rendon, D. Gordon, Starlin Castro, and his pitchers are Aroldis Chapman, Hyunjin Ryu, Justin Verlander, Anibal Sanchez, and Steve Cishek. Would you take either of those offers, and which if you would?
No, I wouldn't do it. The team already has a nice infield with Gordon at second, Rendon at third, respectively. So I don't really see the need to downgrade from the best starter in the game to add third base help. Rendon is going to be playing third base this year, so he loses that second base eligibility moving forward. So if you're adding a Josh Donaldson, you're kind of stuck at third base, and so you've downgraded from Kershaw to, say, Lester or Hamels. And now you have to do another trade to get rid of one of your third basemen to clear that hole. So I just say just keep the ace, keep the best pitcher in the game. You already have a nice little group of keepers already. So I think you're in a good position.
I'm inclined to agree, and for the reason that you outlined. If Anthony Rendon was projected to keep second base eligibility, I think I'd be really tempted by the Donaldson and Lester offer because I do like Lester's move to the National League. I don't necessarily think that he's going to repeat last year's success, but I do think that the regression is going to be less harsh moving from the American League to the National League. But the problem is you really are making a substantial downgrade from Kershaw to Lester, and for what reason? To double up on third baseman? If he filled a need at third base and you could still have Rendon at second base next year, I might be inclined to take that one. I want no part of the Seager, Hayward, Hamels deal. It's kind of a poo-poo platter of decent players, but I don't see anyone in that would be worth forfeiting keep forever Clayton Kershaw.
Yeah, I agree.
The next question comes from MCIV. MCIV is in a 12-team head-to-head keeper league with 5 outfielders and is keeping Giancarlo Stanton, Paul Goldschmidt, George Springer, Julio Teheran, and the top 2 players on that are expected to be on the draft board are Jacoby Ellsbury and Edwin Encarnacion. They want to know, which player would you select? My selection is Edwin Encarnacion by a fairly wide margin, and that's understanding that he's already got Paul Goldschmidt at first base. But I'm enamored with Encarnacion's power. I love the ballpark. I love the lineup. Speaking of Josh Donaldson from the last question, talk about a nice upgrade to an already talented lineup. Would you take Encarnacion or Ellsbury?
I think I like Encarnacion there, but in a 5 outfield league, I can also see the argument for Ellsbury. I wouldn't actually call it a wide margin. I think that's a pretty tough selection. Going back to Springer, I might see if the team with the next pick in the draft will be willing to flip the pick for Springer, since there's obviously so much hype with him, and if it's a league where you can keep people in perpetuity, they might be excited to get a guy as highly regarded as Springer. So if that's the case, then you might be able to end up with both Ellsbury and Encarnacion. You know, in a keeper league, that might actually tempt the other guy. And if you have to kick in like a late pick to get it to work, yeah, I would obviously do that too.
I really like that suggestion, and I too would take Ellsbury to Springer. So if you can make that swap, if that and even if you have to include the late pick like RJ suggested, you might. That's a move that I would make. The final question we've got is presented by JBay038. Huge trade offer in a 14-team head-to-head dynasty league with the following scoring stats for hitters: runs, singles, doubles, triples, homers, RBI, stolen bases, batting average, and OPS, and for pitchers, wins, complete games, saves, earned runs, earned run average, K, holds, whip, relief wins, and quality starts. The offer is Matt Harvey and Byron Buxton for his Chris Bryant. Would you make that swap?
It's a tough one for me. It really boils down to whether you're confident in Harvey staying healthy, because Brian is such a great dynasty commodity at this point that I think you might be able to find a better deal to get a top-level prospect and a healthier pitcher that you might have a higher opinion of and still be able to swap Brian for. So until those avenues are explored, I might not do the deal, but until you've exhausted all options and say you're not as sold at Brian or you're really confident in Harvey, I think I'd go ahead and do it. I think he's close enough to the value of Harvey that it's worthwhile to pick up Buxton if you're going to be able to keep him, for a while with that trade. Unless third base is seen as too big of a hole to fill in this particular lineup, if he doesn't have another good option for third base, or if the draft options are a little dry, maybe I would think about holding on to Bryant then.
It's really nice to see trades like this presented, because it truly is a fair deal. It isn't a slam dunk one way or the other. It's not an insulting offer. And I'm with you. The first thing that I would point out is that amidst all these statistics that they use, K's is not one of them. So Bryant's not going to get penalized for strikeouts. So that's the first thing that I noticed. And it's a 14-team league, so if he is stuck with a really substandard third baseman, it would be hard for me to pull the trigger. But assuming he can get a decent fill-in at third base, I would make the swap as well. I really do like Harvey. I like the spring training reports. The velocity's there. I like hearing that the slider's sharp, and I'm also really a sucker for Byron Buxton. The tools are there. Last year was a lost year, but I mean there are still prospect outlets that would prefer Buxton to Bryant long term. Obviously, defense comes into play with most of these prospect lists since they're not for fantasy purposes. We're talking about a guy that could have average to above average power with top shelf speed, a good batting average, a lot to dream on, and he's not even the headliner of the offer. I have no problem with exploring another offer if you think you can get a slightly better one for Bryant. Obviously, now is the time to shop him. The spring hype is just out of control. But if push comes to shove, I personally would take this Buxton Harvey offer.
Yeah, I agree.
So it was a pleasure having you on, RJ. I had a lot of fun. I look forward to reading more of your work at Fantasy Baseball Cafe, and I'm really looking forward to the fantasy baseball season. And for the listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks.